just as background on me, so I did my undergrad at Cornell, and then I worked in the sort of nuclear power space for a couple of years before I came back to grad school. And so when I came to grad school kind of with a sort of a, industrial perspective. And so I came to grad school, did my background is in sort of thermal sciences, did a lot of research on, electronics, cooling, things like that. And didn't really have preconceived notions really about what I was going to do after grad school when I got here. And so I was kind of looking around at what my options were, whether it's going into academia, going to a national lab. And for various reasons that, we can talk about later if you guys are interested, I didn't feel like either of those was a fit for me. And I didn't want to go back to industry. But there was a guy who was in my research lab, probably had graduated a few years before me, who had commercialized some technology. He was kind of in the early stages of, launching his startup. And so I talked to him a little bit about what he was doing. And, I just kind of came to the conclusion that I wanted to start my own business. I wanted to go do the entrepreneurial thing. And this was probably, 3-4 months before I was ready to defend, that I kind of came to this conclusion. So I told my advisor that's what I wanted to do. And so from there, I had like a little bit of space where I could just kind of start to explore how I would do that. And my first sort of entree into it was really, I looked at, could I commercialize what I had been doing for the last, in grad school. And so we really looked into that, started talking with folks who had been like sort of funders and sponsors for us. And there was interest from that side in terms of trying to commercialize that technology. But I guess during that diligence period, we kind of came to the conclusion, we had some IP, but the way the university had sort of written the license agreement, between, folks who had funded my research and Cincinnati University, those guys all had kind of, access to that IP. And so it became clear kind of over time that it was going to be difficult to build a business on that, or really it would be difficult for us to fundraise based on sort of that type of foundational IP. And so we kind of pivoted and said, well, where can we take this technology and not really the technology, but sort of the knowledge base that I had and the expertise that I had and apply it to something else. And so from there, we kind of launched a company that sort of took, and this was started off as sort of electronics thermal management, and we started to build a business based on sort of thermal management in sort of the skincare, laser dermatology space. It was like a similar problem, different space, all new IP. And so we, we developed the product. We took it really, found, sort of, we didn't raise funds, but we, found grants and things like that that helped us to kind of take it through clinical trials and prove a concept essentially. And, through that process, kind of learned about, what building a business was like. But ultimately kind of came to the conclusion, this was maybe a couple of years down the road, that, the technology as it was, it didn't have the sort of, the technical power that I felt like it needed in order to be able to build a business on. Sort of, the data we got back from those trials said, I don't think we're going to really build a business on this. Kind of in parallel to that, I met a guy on my committee who was trying to launch another company, Carbice. And so, during this time when I was launching, Invisicool, I was kind of in my spare time working with him, learning about, what the technology was, trying to figure out a market for it, if there was a market and things like that. And so in parallel with sort of this first entree into entrepreneurship, I started to write grants and things like that for Carbice. And kind of when we came to the endpoint of, Invisicool, this sort of first company in those trials, we had won a phase 1 SBIR with Carbice to kind of start to commercialize that technology. And so I tried to transition full-time into Carbice, and that was maybe 2016. And so we've been kind of growing the company ever since then.
Okay, well, let me ask a question of you, Dr. Green. My understanding is that you've had some experience with ICOR.
That's right. So we did essentially sort of the ICOR Light program that came with sort of the phase 1 SBIR process, the boot camp.
So what lessons did you, and we've been talking today with the fellows about like the customer focused piece, and sound like you've had some experience in that area. Certainly both of you have, but what takeaways did you get from ICOR that you think supported or your development? I guess, when did you do that? Was that before or after you did your own company?
So it was after. So I had been working through, learning on my own what a company was on my own long before I did there's probably a 4-year gap in between when I did the I-Core program and when I graduated from undergrad. And probably, I think the biggest lesson, the most valuable thing, I think, for me was really, getting out and talking to customers and listening to them about what they thought was valuable, what they're trying to understand, what their real pain points were with, the solutions that they kind of already had in place. Because, we kind of came to I-Core with the perspective of, here's our product, how do we sell it to people, right? And I think kind of going out and talking to people, what we really started to learn was, people had a problem that our technology could solve, but the problem was, one sort of layer of, a feature that we really didn't even consider valuable. It was just kind of something we built in. And people would always say to us, I love that, right? We put adhesive on, what we make in order to, allow people to install it, a little bit more easily. But really, we were trying to make something with better cooling. And people kept saying, I like the adhesive. I like the fact that you can stick it on. And, we've kind of grown since then from what that product was then. But that sort of adhesive, as something that people like, we kind of kept that, that feature. And that kind of kept us grounded in terms of what our real differentiating feature was. It kind of stuck with us, and it's helped us to remain differentiated in a marketplace that I think is, in some ways crowded. So really, okay. I guess to summarize, really just listening to our customers and potential customers about what they really want, as opposed to us trying to sell them what it is we think we have.
Thank you for that. Dr. Adefeso, I think that, certainly the discussion around customer discovery and what you've learned along the way, what lessons have you learned that you could share with our fellows?
Yeah, so for our technology being a medical treatment, our conversations are more with clinicians and what they feel they need in terms of disease treatment. And we were going after a disease that there is no current drug on the market approved for use. And so our discovery was more theoretical, meaning we didn't have to call up patients to ask whether they needed our technology or not. The disease we're going after is for people who are in critical need. And so again, it's not the best, you can't call them up while they're hooked up to a machine, for example, to say, do you think you could benefit from this technology? So our conversation have been with clinicians who treat this patient to get a sense of what type of therapy they find might be useful in this indication. Now that the company is formed, the folks that are on the business side of that are doing customer discovery in the sense of talking to pharmaceutical companies to see what their interests are in terms of the future of them, or the future interest in acquiring this technology, what kind of clinical trial data they would like to see before they might want to buy or acquire the company. Those are the kind of customer discovery that they are doing on that business side.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm gonna go to our fellows. What questions do you have, fellows? The floor is open to you. You can just ask your question of our panelists.
Hi, Ade, UMBC PhD student. I actually have 2 questions, but for each of the panelists. First would be for Dr. Eniola-Adefeso. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. But did you start your entrepreneurial venture pre-tenure or after tenure? And yeah, sorry, because if in the event that you did do it pre-tenure, how did you manage that process? And if you didn't, would you advise individuals who are interested in becoming an academic and a tenure track academic? What would your advice be? Wait.
So I had submitted invention disclosure pre-tenure that didn't really get picked up or go anywhere. So this venture is happening post-tenure. And just looking at the amount of time that I've put to this, I certainly might give, I wouldn't necessarily go and advise somebody to jump in fully in the way that I've done, because it does require a lot of time. Now, folks that are late stage pre-tenure, meaning it's your 4th year, 5th year, 6th year, you already have your lab running on its own and don't need to engage one-on-one with students, then you might still be able to give the time to spend on this. Academic time is you buy out of something to do something else. So somebody who's able to pull that off can certainly do this pre-tenure. I think it would be a tough battle for somebody in the first 3 years of the academic track to do this, because it does require a lot of work, and you are still required to be writing grants, teaching, and service, all of the things that have to show up on your tenure casebook for tenure. So it may be a little difficult to do it in the first 3 years, but I think late stage pre-tenure and certainly post-tenure would work well.
Thank you. And I'll wait to talk with Dr. Green to allow other fellows to ask questions.
All right, well, while we wait, let me introduce, we have Dr. Camille Martin with us. As I said earlier, she's the co-founder and CEO of C-Spire Skincare, and she's also a former I-Corps participant. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on your panel. My apologies for being delayed. The life of entrepreneurs is somewhat unpredictable. We're gearing up for a huge fundraising event tomorrow, hosted by Northeastern, but through some of our publicity, we've been getting a lot of interest from other investments. I guess it's a combination between our technology and maybe the big push for these corporations as well as individuals to support diverse talent. And so I've been fully taking advantage of that. And so my apologies for my late meeting. I'll give a short intro to what we're doing at our company. We study new ingredients that can come to market in skincare and sun care applications. Our model is a business-to-business model where we look to support the brands from major CPG companies, consumer product good companies, by supplying them with this new innovative class of ingredients. And so we're really excited to be able to be at this stage where we have raised our first initial round, so pre-seed round of investment, and we're looking to open up our next round at the end of this year. So it's been a great journey, and I'm happy to answer any questions about transitioning from the bench and going beyond to the business.
Thank you. All right, we'll turn it back over to our fellows. What questions do you have? Your show.
I have one question. I always struggle with this mic, so sorry about that. But it was actually for Dr. Green. I was just thinking about, what process did you go when you were building your team, and how did you bring people on? Because one thing I was thinking about was what other parts of your team did you need when you were building your company? And then also, like, did you have anybody to manage finances for you? How did you take care of that? Did you have an accountant or anything of that nature?
Sure. Yeah. So we've definitely leveraged. So we're currently located in incubator space, essentially adjacent to Georgia Tech's campus. And a lot of our team building has been through Georgia Tech and through relationships we have at Georgia Tech, whether that's sort of full-time hires, sort of our first, our first sort of full-time engineer that we brought on worked with us, back when he was an undergrad. Just doing undergraduate research. And then he had a twin brother. And so we brought him on. So a lot of it really is, and I think not just in terms of building our team, but in general, it's about having a network and leveraging that network. Because, especially when you're small, you have to be very careful about who you bring on, because those people can have a tremendous impact on, your business is fragile when it's small. And so you hire the wrong person, it can take a long time to recover from that. And you also just need to be sort of careful with, what you spend money on. So we really kind of used our network. LinkedIn I used to a large degree, but also just recruiting on campus to bring on sort of technical folks. And it's the same thing with business folks. We kind of worked with the business school, so working with, it's starting off just sort of, collaborative projects with MBAs to do things like cost analysis. To initially the idea or the sort of the connection was sort of doing cost analysis so we could show like an ROI to one of our customers. But through that, we got to know some of those students and some of those teams. And so one of those guys eventually joined our team. And so really, that's really what it's always about, is, you're always sort of growing your network, always meeting people, not necessarily to hire them, but just to know them so that you know what they are, they know what you're doing. And when you find a good fit, and when you have the opportunity, you can kind of bring those people on.
I think Vanessa, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, I have a question for Dr. Eniola-Adefeso as well. I guess my question was, like you said, a lot of times the consumers or the people you're talking to most are clinicians. And I guess on something similar, one thing that I wanted to know if you had any strategies for connecting with more clinicians, because I'm working with know some people locally, but then we've also been told to maybe look at people in different kind of environments. So that was just kind of my question. Any strategies or any tips that you saw that worked out when trying to connect with this community?
So clinicians at Michigan are accustomed to working with engineers. So I think the barrier is low in terms of getting access to them. And so what we found useful is we do our due diligence to identify the right clinicians that we know would be interested in a novel technology. So for example, on a project that we're doing that involves dermatology, we simply look through the catalog to see which clinicians are treating patients in this space. And we sent them an email with the right email title. And by and large, we got near 100% response. Even a few of the clinicians we contacted were outside of Michigan. But because they could see that this was something that could provide a better way of treating their patients, they were more inclined to at least engage with us with a conversation.
And I just want to jump in and say that also with our business, since we're focused a lot on topicals applied to skin, a lot of our advisors are also from the clinical dermatology space. And so there's definitely an appetite for new technologies. And I think there's definitely a lot of benefit to identifying the right clinicians, because it can really come through with helping identify the key problems that you're trying to address and understanding where in the pipeline can you integrate your technology, as well as using their networks to be able to get to the right customers, whether your customer is a clinician or is the direct to consumer. And that's definitely something where on both sides, we've been able to create our advisory board by really identifying different personnel throughout the pipeline, starting at the clinic all the way through, consumer facing brands.
Dr. Martin.
Mm-hmm.
I actually know Dr. Martin from Northeastern University when I was up there in Boston. So we were gym fellows together and actually did a grad program. So I first just want to say like super huge congratulations on finishing your degree and earning that doctor of Dr. Camille Martin. So just wanted to get across on that. And then I also wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about your experience specifically with I-Corps and how it was working, as I understand, working with I-Corps and working with NSF.
Mm-hmm. So I owe a lot of what I do now on day-to-day as an entrepreneur to my experience with I-Corps. So prior to that, my biggest vision was to work at a multinational beauty company, you know, Estee Lauder, L'Oreal, Revlon. Being able to participate in I-Corps really opened up my eyes to see the opportunities that exist for someone with my background as a technical entrepreneur, someone who understood the science and could work alongside the mentors at I-Corp to be able to bring this to a commercial good. This was really key to my development and really opened my eyes to see what it takes to take something from the bench all the way to the shelf. And I could say there was a lot of iterations. From those initial meetings, we went from a cosmetic company to now being a cosmetic dermatology private label ingredient supplier. There was a lot that went into this, being able to interview with customers, being able to meet with people who could help guide us on our IP strategy, as well as our go-to-market strategy and revenue models. So I definitely could say that being able to be associated with the mentors through the I-Corp program and being able to have their guidance with being able to navigate those customer interviews was key to us eventually pursuing the startup.
Ade, I believe you had the second part of your question.
Yes, I do. And it will probably be relevant for Doctors Martin and Green. And I'm really interested in the process of funding and grant writing. So like, what are some of the best practices, Dr. Martin, in your case, with those different, the seed funding process, but then also Dr. Green, and I think you kind of alluded to earlier that you're in Georgia Tech's incubator, but you're a separate entity. And you're not like an academic. So what was that grant writing process like? What were the venues that you went to, or funding units that you went to? So anything around funding. And Dr. Adefeso, you can contribute as well.
Sure. So I'll start. So we kind of went through multiple. So we ultimately, did grant writing, but we started off there, and there may be programs, where you are as well. But in the state of Georgia, there's sort of these sort of smaller seed grants that kind of got us started. So there's this thing called the Georgia Research Alliance that is really focused on, and these are like small pots of money, $25,000, $50,000, that are really focused on technology transfer. So helping you to get, university research out of the university. So that's kind of where we started, was with that. And there's like a phase 1, phase 2 to that. And that's structured such that those funds all have to come back through Georgia Tech. They come from the state of Georgia. It's a state of Georgia program. I mean, and as a part of that, there's also mentors and things like that that you can get. So that was where we kind of did proof of principle for technology development, met with customers, sort of proved that there was sort of a business model to be had. From there, we went through, we ultimately got funding from NSF SBIR, and we wrote 3. We wrote 3 before we got one, before we actually won one. And part of that is really understanding the process of writing those grants, and having sort of a business in place, having, you need to have SAM and all these sort of registrations in place just to be able to submit, right? And so there were some folks for us over in sort of ATDC is another sort of, umbrella incubator organization in the state of Georgia, where folks could kind of help us to understand what that process looked like and how to actually get the grant just submitted so it could be reviewed to some extent. And then, we got reviews back and submitted another one that we ultimately got funded. And so really just kind of taking that feedback that we got from our first submission. But another thing that we did, us personally, another thing that we did was before we submitted that the SPI that was ultimately funded, we took a trip up to DC and met with folks who, are associated with NSF, just to kind of talk to them, to try to understand what they're looking for, what made sense, the type of feedback that we were going to get from the proposal. And all of that is really about trying to understand, you know, when you have somebody reviewing a grant, they're looking for, in many cases, a specific thing. So we've gotten NSF SBIR, we've also gotten grants from DOD and folks like that. And very, you know, when you look at folks like that, DOD, they're usually looking for something in particular. And in many cases, just having a conversation or two to understand what they're looking for can help you to craft a grant that that's going to be, you know, well reviewed ultimately, and that you will win. You know, we've done other things since then. You know, we've raised seed money and things like that. We're in the process of raising another round right now. But I think one of the sort of really valuable things to keep in mind with grant writing, especially for a company like ours, a manufacturer. So we're a manufacturing business, right? And so there's capital equipment and things like that that are required. And in many cases, folks who are going to be, you know, your VCs and those types of people don't want to invest in capital equipment. They don't want to invest in, what they want to invest is, you know, essentially repeating some sort of business model that you've established on a small scale, and them giving you money to help sort of market and grow that, right? And so you need to find other places to fund things like equipment. And that's where grants become invaluable, because, you know, you can pay for those things and use sort of VC or seed money for things like personnel or marketing and things like that.
Okay, Dr. Martin?
So I can say I kind of have an unfair advantage. My business partner is my former professor, PI, where I got my PhD. So her expertise is in grant writing as a professor. Right now, she's still maintaining her role as a professor. And so she works at our company as a consultant, where her primary responsibility is grant writing. So we have also targeted similar organizations like SBIR to start with. Our initial round was supported by a venture capital firm, The Engine, which is backed by MIT. And so our startup is fairly young. We've just been fully operational with a venture-backed budget since February, but we are looking forward to applying to the SBIR grant this fall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think my experience is a little different in the sense that our technology went to licensing by an established biotech. And they, of course, decided to do a startup focused around this particular IP, but they already have a well-established business structure. And so they came in with their own CEO and other officers. I am staying on as a consultant, serving as the chief technology advisor or officer. But a lot of the fundraising is using the established channels that they have, and they are going to venture capitalists. That's the main approach they've taken at this point. Because they are trying to go to clinical trials, which typically requires more money than SBIR and things can provide, they are not looking at those route at this moment.
Thank you. I actually have one more follow-up question. It's more of just very practical, and actually two. Sorry. One, what was that process like with individuals you're at your university, and how did you have those conversations around intellectual property, and then structuring those, and then ensuring in the future you get what is due to you, but those institutions that supported you to get there are helpful too. And then this is just very real, very practical. I'm going into 2 years of marriage. It's what is your work-life balance like? And what are some of, you can share anecdotal evidence, you can share like, hey, I didn't do this right, you should do that right, etc. But yeah, just like real practical advice, that would be super helpful.
So I'll just jump in, and first question, intellectual property, super, super, super 100% important. The number one part of your startup is your intellectual property, whether that be patents, trade secrets, some combination of those, trademarks or whatever, depending on what your model is, but patents and your intellectual property is very, very important. For us, when we started writing our first applications, I was still a graduate student. It was very apparent very early on that I would be the one that would be bringing this to full functioning business. And so we were limited with a lot of the terms based on the university. We're coming from Northeastern in regards to the ownership of those patents as it stands as individual patents. But we're in the process of licensing from Northeastern into the company. These terms are really independent of the university that you are or corporation who essentially sponsors research and is owning your intellectual property. So there's no common answer on how to navigate the ownership, because that's something that's going to be outlined by your institution. Work-life balance, I can say when I was as a graduate student, I was working in the day in the lab, maybe 12, 16 hours. And I would spend still time in between experiments trying to figure out what is the product market fit for our technology. When I could attend on the weekend seminars on regulatory, different buyers and sellers within the industry to be able to understand what are the requirements to bring a technology or an ingredient like mine to the market, and then going back to the lab and designing experiments to de-risk that. And so while I was a graduate student, it was very, very school business focused and not much life. Now that I'm a like independent or like a entrepreneur where I'm working full-time on my company, I've definitely made it a big part to dedicate, you know, appropriate hours to the startup company, but definitely through my experience, I gave so much of myself. And I don't want to say don't give your all in a startup, but I was at a point where I was really stretching myself too thin as a graduate student, trying to do both a graduate student and an entrepreneur at the degree that I was functioning. I was working with patent agents. I was meeting with investors way before we had an idea that was really worth pitching, and doing my experiments and traveling to conferences. So it was really difficult for me to balance my life at that time. So I've made it a big part of my life to make sure that I'm working on the startup and I'm pushing it forward, but I definitely take time for myself and my relationships.
Dr. Munn, you talked about a number of challenges. How did I-Corps help you prepare for those challenges as they came up?
Yeah, so I can only speak really highlighting and uplifting my mentors who have been able to help me navigate these different obstacles, whether it be understanding the fundraising space, venture capital, whether it is understanding IP. How do you navigate that? What does it take? How do you really position your technology where you're writing about it specific enough to be able to prevent competition, but it's broad enough to also keep people from just tagging on. So really, I can just speak to having a diverse group of mentors coming not just from business, but also intellectual property, also in technologists and scientists, clinicians. And so being able to and also big corporations like CPG companies, getting access to them, being able to have this real diverse mixture of people on our side was able to help us draft the pathway forward and create a strategy where we'll ultimately be successful. So really don't rely just on your PI or a business school professor. Not either or, combination. Have someone who knows legal, who has experience bringing new technology to the forefront. So just try to grab as many different pieces of the puzzle in your circle as possible.
Thanks.
I'll add a little bit more on that, because I think a couple of things that are, I think, important is, one, to just take an active, sense of ownership in any type of IP that you are trying to get issued. It's really up to you to make sure that that IP is going to be valuable at the end of the day. Because there's one thing to have a patent, and there's another thing to have a patent that has some value, that is defensible, that gives you some piece of the market. And ultimately, the university will take care of that for you. You can submit an invention disclosure and they will walk it through the process. But I think it's important, one, that you stay engaged in that so that you understand what claims are actually getting issued. You know, for us personally, you know, we asked the university to use a different set of lawyers, just from, you know, previous experience with whom they work with, that we felt like did a little bit better job with developing the IP. But the other piece is, you know, what the licensing agreement looks like. All of that is negotiable. You know, the university has, in many cases, they may have standard terms that they'll offer you. But at the end of the day, the university wants this tech, and it really kind of to some extent depends on your university, but they want to see the technology get adopted, get used. That's the only way they're going to ever extract any value out of what they invest in it. And so make sure that the terms that you lay out make sense for you in terms of being able to have a profitable business down the road. You can always reject what they offer, because at the end of the day, in most cases, you're the only person who's going to commercialize that technology. The technology needs a champion. And so you just have to be aware of the power that you have in that situation and be willing to you know, engage in those types of negotiations. And then the last thing I would say is, as soon as you can, own your own IP, right? So it is tremendously valuable to have a university who will pay for what is a relatively expensive thing, you know, filing and prosecuting IP. But at the end of the day, there's a cost to that doesn't go away for the life of that IP. And so, you know, our probably second piece of IP, you know, what we did was we paid to use university facilities to develop sort of the technology, develop the understanding that went into the IP, such that it was ours, and we didn't have to negotiate anything with them after the fact. And those things ultimately become just a lot more valuable to you because you don't have royalties and things like that you're going to be paying for the rest of, you know, forever, for the life of that IP if you do it that way. And in many cases, and I know like prosecuting IP is expensive, but like with anything else in a startup, I think the important thing, a lot of what you're trying to do is get people to bet on you. And you can do that with lawyers, just like you can do that with funders and VCs and those other types of things. So if you have something that you think is valuable and you can't necessarily pay $100,000 or whatever it's going to cost to really fully prosecute that IP, you can talk with a lawyer and negotiate better terms for how you're going to pay for that or how you're going to pay for that over time in order to be able to do those types of things. So always just kind of take a sense of ownership to some extent, I guess, is sort of the take-home message in whatever path your IP prosecution takes.
Dr. Adefeso, what would you like to add?
Just to follow up, it is important though to highlight that if your ideas and technology were developed while you were employed as a faculty or a graduate student at a university, the university owns that idea. So there is no flexibility in terms of developing your own. Now, the university could decide that they don't want to commercialize that idea, then they can give it to you, license it to you or whatever. But by and large, any kind of ideas and innovation that was generated during your time working as a graduate student at a university belongs to the university.
Okay.
I just want to echo just lastly how important this is. Everything that both Dr. Green and Dr. Eniola, I hope I'm saying this correct, both are so, oh, wait, can you repeat it?
Eniola.
Wait, repeat it one more time.
Eniola.
Eniola are so key. Everything that they both said were so key because you have to understand the limitations being at a graduate student at a university, that ownership structure, because this is something that it's so core to the business, and something that we're currently in with our company is being able to finalize the appropriate terms. Just like Dr. Green mentioned, they're negotiable, but there are some limitations just based on the structure of where that intellectual property was developed. And so just have that understanding that even though you're a graduate student, you may be a graduate student in the lab developing it. This does not necessarily, just because you are 100% pipetting, translate to 100% ownership. and just making sure that your expectations are calibrated based on what your university outlines, but understand that they could be open to negotiation, because this is really core to not only how you start your business, but how it survives.
We have time for a couple more questions. I saw that Eddie has his hand up, but he's been talking quite a bit. Anybody else have a question? I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I just got
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I just got a question. It might be some steps back from what the panel has discussed, but I want to say thank you very much, because this has been an eye opener for me. I just want any one of you to kind of address. Did you always have an entrepreneurial mindset when you were like in grad school, or I'm just curious about what created this spark for you in terms of going down this path?
So I would say I had zero entrepreneurship bone in me. In fact, throughout my career, I was always of the mindset that we just do exciting science and we publicize it. So I ended up here really more from the fact that our work and our lab did have genuine interest in developing technology that could help people. And in interactions with clinicians, they say to us, well, that's a great and grand gesture, but nothing you develop will get to the clinic unless it's protected, unless somebody can make money off of it. So that really, coming to that realization, that's what really pushed us to say, once we realized we had something that could help, then it became a moral duty for us to protect it so that it can get to the patient.
Well, I think for me, personality-wise, I had sort of an entrepreneurial sort of stint. I leaned in that direction, but didn't really understand what that pathway even was, But sort of, I talked about, I came in, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, like if I wanted to go in academia or not. But I think one thing that would, as I was kind of looking around at what that pathway looked like, I always felt like I wanted to take my research the next step further. And in a lot of ways, that wasn't really encouraged from an academic perspective. Even if you look at least in my field, if you look at the difference between sort of the applied journals and sort of the fundamental science journals, the fundamental science is always higher prestige, right? And, just kind of going back to, for me, like what was originally my master's project, I had this project, it was going really well. I'd made some advancements with it. This was like a DARPA program way back when, and sort of I gave a talk at sort of this consortium, Equilibrium, and sort of the feedback that I got afterwards, I thought I'd done a good job, but the feedback I got afterward was you've taken that far enough. We don't need to look at it anymore. Let's move on to something else. And so I had to really come up with a whole nother project, for what I was going to do for my PhD. And so like for me, I really wanted that sense of satisfaction of taking something from an idea to something that people held in their hands and made a real impact on the world. And I didn't see any other sort of realistic pathway to doing that than entrepreneurship. So that to some extent is what motivated me to go in that direction, more so than sort of making a lot of money or anything like that, was just wanting to have ownership over the entire life and success of some type of innovation.
For me, up until like the week that we got our financing deal, I was interviewing at multinational beauty companies. So I was very much so still playing the fence of industry, big money, and a startup, really risky, low money, but maybe a much longer game and great opportunities to build, lead, and impact change in an organization on a larger scale. And so I can say, like, being an entrepreneur, when I used to tell people I was studying chemistry to work in cosmetic science, everyone always said, oh, you're going to start your own beauty brand. And I would say like, no, I just want to work at L'Oreal and Estee Lauder. Like, that's like a good idea, but that's not what I'm interested in, like not at all. So for me, it came down to the point where I understood that in order for the IP that I had developed to be able to be useful and to be able to actually make some kind of profits on what we put on, I had to drive it. It was my professor and she was remaining as a professor. It was try it or it was going to die. And for me, I see this as a huge opportunity, not only to be able to be in a position to really impact change, but also be able to learn a number of skills that I would not be open to if I was solely in a product development role at a multinational. So if you don't feel it right now, still keep pushing forward and just like let what's going on inside of you lead you, because it wasn't like I always knew. I didn't always know. I had a great offer with a lot more money. But I really did a lot of internal reflection. And ultimately, if you decide to right out of graduate school, go into entrepreneurship, or later on in your life, just know like both routes are okay. Each path is really individual because each has its rewards and its sacrifices. So keep that in mind.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Just hearing your stories in a little more detail. Thank you.
Okay, we're about to get into our wrap up, but I did want to give Ade a chance to ask this question, so we'll end on your question.
Oh, no, I was just using the thumbs up as like recognition that what they were saying was really good. I wasn't. That's all. I didn't have my hand.
Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay, all right, well, fine. I want to respect our panelists' time. Again, we very much appreciate the fact that you come and you share it with our fellows, and hopefully, well, I know you're inspired. I'm kind of looking at everybody's faces, and everybody's kind of like in a daze somewhat because you've gotten so much good information, and it's causing you to think about your own situations and circumstances. And certainly from our breakout earlier, I know that the folks in my group had a lot to think about. So I want to thank Dr. Green, thank Dr. Martin, Dr. Eniola-Adefeso for what you've shared with us and with our fellows. And again, I appreciate it very, very much. And I'm sure that our fellows do as well. And if you give a virtual hand clap, I'd appreciate that. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our own Dr. Qualls to kind of start our wrap up for today.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the participants. This has been an amazing day. This is our second week of having our GEMpreneur workshops, and you guys have not disappointed. I think that the more we do this and the more that you share your experience, even in this workshop, and I was taking notes of some of just the small things or comments that people were saying, this is all about learning. So I think back when Grant was talking about the valuation, and if they invested 120 million, how much would that company expect it to be worth? Little things like how do you calculate valuation are going to be very important along your journey and pathway to commercialization. Things like, I never thought about myself being an entrepreneur in this manner. I never thought about it in that manner. That's why we do what we do. That's what this initiative is all about. It's the inclusion in the innovation space. And as we said from the beginning, and you looked at that collage of pictures, your picture is now in the center. You are a GEMpreneur, and you will eventually be taking some of your academic research and commercializing it. And hey, honestly, some of you may not take that path, but what we also want you to realize and remember is regardless of your commercialization pathway or not, we want you to now begin to be thinking more entrepreneurial and networking, because there's so much more that you'll be able to do. So many more doors will be open for opportunities when you change or shift your mindset and knowing that the possibilities are out there. So a couple of things I want you to do. Latane has talked about some things. Grant has shared some things. If you think that you are interested, if you think that you have research, or even if you don't know, set up a time and talk with us. We want to help you and walk you through that process, even it's a part of that thought process. But as entrepreneurs, how are you preparing yourself? What is it that you're doing? We spend a lot of time focused on our research. We spend a lot of time reading academic journals, our peer-reviewed journals. What are you doing to kind of feed that other side? What are you doing to feed the business and the entrepreneurial side? What are you reading? What are you watching? Are you listening to TED Talks? Are you listening to motivational speakers? Are you reading journal articles? So I always say my challenge to you now is, if you're not reading Forbes or Entrepreneur magazines or Black Enterprise, make sure you're reading them at least once a week. Participate in some of these online discussions on LinkedIn and some of the LinkedIn groups, just so you're beginning to become familiar with the terminology, with the language, and even some of the players in the field. Those things are extremely, extremely important. And so if we go back to our network, building skills and learning and sharing and taking risks, remember that cycle? Because you're the gempreneur that was born to be made. That's what my challenge is to you. Thank you again for coming out and supporting this workshop today. We are really, really looking forward to your feedback on the survey, and we're looking forward to you sharing what you learned with others, other fellows who have not yet participated in this workshop. We have several others that will be occurring throughout the rest of the summer. And again, looking forward to having you there. We have about 8 minutes left. So if there are any other questions for me or any of my team, please feel free to open up your mics or put in the chat box.
Thank you for hosting this. I feel like it was eye-opening. I definitely learned a lot. Even as somebody with doing an MS, and I'm not necessarily coming from a research background, but just to hear you guys talk about how to handle IP, building your team, how to get those grants going. I feel like I learned a lot. And if you're ever looking for a good software engineer, don't forget about me. Matthias did me on LinkedIn.
Love it. And he'll bring a cup of coffee along the way. That's what you got to do, Matthias. This is about networking. We're learning, we're the GEM family. You need to know who your brothers and sisters are and what they do. We help each other. Okay, Latane, I guess someone else has questions for me or Grant or Talmisha or you. So let's wrap it up.
All right, I see a lot of dropping in. That was great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Hey, listen, we appreciate you being here. As we started out today, we told you that, you know, this was your day. This is, and Brennan put a dot on it by saying this is your time. So again, we're at the end of that time. We really hope that you got something out of it that may change your trajectory of the rest of your life. And not only your life, but your children and your grandchildren's lives. Being able to be in a position where you can build generational wealth by taking your research and being able to commercialize it. So again, feel free to reach out. You have my information. You also know the GEMi4 at gemfellowship.org. Use either of those emails to to express your interest, and we'll reach back out to you. Again, this is real. This is yours. Again, GEM is